So we're shortly going to be hearing from a panel that will be talking about barriers to belonging, expulsions, right-wing populism, and the global struggle for democracy. So we have been living during a period of rapid social, political, and economic change. Widespread economic precarity and wealth inequality paired with the persistent systemic othering and growing demands for inclusion by those who are excluded has created a ripe opening for the global rise of right-wing populism and authoritarian regimes. To exacerbate these challenges, there's a growing recognition that we live on a planet that is convulsing from human-induced climate change. In this discussion, we will explore the interrelationship among political crises and the rise of populist movements as it relates to shifts in the economy, expanded globalization and migration, technological changes, erosion of redistributive tax policies, and unsustainable way of living on the planet. So to present this conversation for us, our panel will be led by Tarso Luís Ramos, and the participants with him are Saskia Sassen and Kumi Naidoo, who we heard from yesterday. And you can read their bios in your program so that you're gonna know how amazing they are as they talk to you, but you can look them up and read more about them. So please help me welcome them to the stage.
Bom dia.
Buenos dias.
Good morning. International Workers' Day is a day for resistance, and we'll be talking about resistance. But not only resisting the bad, but also looking ahead to building alternatives, the kind of alternatives we need for a more inclusive, just, and democratic set of societies. I'm thrilled to be here this morning when Connie Heller and John Powell invited me to come and present on the rise of right-wing populism and nationalism globally. I got very excited and, in fact, a little bit relieved. I was quite worried that in the aftermath of Donald Trump's electoral college victory, that the already kind of profound parochialism of the United States, right, that irony of being at the center of empire, yet the most parochial country on the planet, might be enhanced as people really turned inward to think, how could this happen to us? What just happened here? And so I'm thrilled to be sitting here together with a couple of truly global analysts and activists to think about broader dynamics. As you heard, our charge is to talk about the interrelated phenomena of right-wing populism, growing nationalism, and other global crises, including the possibility of climate catastrophe, the incredibly extractive and unjust structure of our global economy, and some other dynamics. I've been asked to both present and to facilitate a discussion among the three of us. And so I'm going to take the liberty to start off by setting a little bit of a frame. You'll have to forgive this sort of America First position. It seems to be in the air a little bit these days. I do just want to say that I'm just back from a meeting in Spain, in Barcelona, Spain, where I had an opportunity to meet with social movement activists from all over the world. And it's really striking that this phenomena of growing nationalism, right-wing populism, is quite global in character. So whether this, we're speaking of the possibility of Marine Le Pen and the National Front being competitive in the French presidential campaigns coming up in just a couple of weeks, or whether it's Modi's consolidation of power alongside Hindu nationalism in India, the recent parliamentary coup in Brazil, or Duterte's, the president of the Philippines, campaign of wide-scale extrajudicial executions that, among other things, have apparently won him an invitation to the White House. These phenomena are truly global in scale. So the US presidential election was not the first, and unfortunately it's not likely to be the last shoe to drop. And what I think is fair to describe is a global political and social realignment along a right-wing axis. My own organization, Political Research Associates, was formed 36 years ago, largely in response to the election of Ronald Reagan, which was made possible in part by the organizing of previously apolitical conservative Christian evangelicals in this country and other social and political forces that called themselves the New Right, that launched a program that included a neoliberal economic program, a program of economic austerity, of shrinking the scale of social investment of government. In this period of time, in the time of Reagan and of Thatcher, the practical opportunities to apply these ideas occurred in such popular democratic context, right, as Pinochet's Chile, the the dictatorship in that country. So I think some of my colleagues here are going to unpack a little bit this terminology that we sometimes use of neoliberalism, but I've made it here to suggest the imposition of austerity and debt on governments, the slashing of social spending, the location of economic policy making beyond democratic reach and often beyond democratic comprehension, the hyper-concentration of wealth that gives rise to oligarchic economic and political forces, including in places what we might call democracies like the United States, and the resultant decline in economic and social security for everyday people. Such conditions create resentments that, as PRA's founder, Jean Hardesty, put it, are readily mobilized into right-wing campaigns. We already heard this moment that here in the United States, there are long continuities, right, in terms of the kind of right-wing populist campaigning that reached a culmination in the campaign in the election of Donald Trump. Since we're here at the Othering and Belonging Conference, I want to give just a quick kind of overview of my sense of the way in which that right-wing narrative has come together. Candidate Trump's message was quite consistent. It involved this idea that liberal elites, including banks and political elites, are taking your stuff, right? Your money, your status, your security, your country, and giving all of that to undeserving, dangerous, dark-skinned, foreign, non-Christian people in a form of political patronage in exchange for their support. So rhetorically, right-wing populism attacks upwards. It names elites. Donald Trump talked about Wall Street excesses. But in terms of its program, the tongue lashing goes upwards, but the actual lashes, the actual punishment, the actual policy attacks are always focused downward. In this narrative, there's a linkage of the racial and demographic change in the country to the precarious economic and social status of everyday people, particularly a people that's defined in an exclusionary, racially and culturally exclusionary notion of who the real people are. A racialized version is, Doug McAdam was saying, of the makers and takers framework. In this sense, the narrative, however bumbling it might sound in any particular formulation, however challenged by syntax it might be, the message was incredibly coherent, and it put together this question of race, the racial identity of the nation, and the economic viability of the people in a very powerful way. By contrast, at least here in the United States, among progressives, we heard a lot of discussion about the fragmentation among progressives. We have two very strong, but actually very atomized discourses. We have a discourse around economic inequality, about the concentration of wealth, this notion of the 1%, that doesn't really deal with race, except perhaps in the context of disproportionate harm, or sometimes deals with the economy in order to avoid talking about race altogether. We have another very powerful set of discourses around racial injustice in the United States, but most of what the broad public receives about that is not connected to the economy. These are folks who have not studied, the intricacies of the Movement for Black Lives policy platform. And so we have these distinct, even competitive narratives around race and the economy coming from progressives on the left, And we have a very integrated rhetoric that's coming from the right with a very powerful, if simplistic, wrong and dangerous set of explanations for economic precarity. There was nobody here, and I think that there are very few places around the world where we could point to somebody who's pointing out, for instance, that racism has been economic suicide for most white people in this country for decades. If ever there was a moment where racism protected a kind of white working class, those days are long gone. In fact, it's appeals to racism that have compelled many white people to vote to undo their own social safety net, their own benefits, to undermine public education, to undermine investments in healthcare, to undermine investments in public health, and so forth. But we're not very good at putting these pieces strongly together. Trump ran against the Republican Party in many ways, and to a certain extent created dismay within his own party that's coming back to haunt him now. And this is an important thing to note because it speaks to the fact that the right wing in this country and other countries is not a monolithic thing. It's a set of coalitions across different power centers in the country. And I want to just talk for a minute about a couple of the big winners in the right-wing coalition that exists within the United States, because I think there are some parallels around the globe. Two of the big winners were the so-called alt-right, which is a coalition of white nationalists and sort of hyper-misogynists, and the Christian right. And while very different movements, they share the distinction of being among the most misogynist movements or sectors of the right wing in the United States. This is worth noting because the oft-remarked climate of misogyny here in the United States is not merely a reflection of the personal failings of the now 45th President of the United States, a serial sexual assailant, but speaks to something deeper, I think, that's happening in the country, and it's worth acknowledging that misogyny is a critical component of authoritarianism wherever it's reared its head. And so we can think of it as an indication of a culture of hypermasculinity or even militarism that is developing in the United States and in some other places around the globe. Another important characteristic of the religious right in the United States and globally is in many cases it has served as a kind of handmaiden to neoliberal or austerity economics. By mobilizing vast numbers of people to vote for a political class that has ushered in austerity politics, even if what they're being asked to vote on are separate issues related to restricting women's bodily autonomy or traditional gender roles or opposing the full humanity and civil and human rights of sexual minorities. What Robert Frank referred to as the problem with Kansas is indeed the problem also with the United States as a whole. And in Brazil, where evangelicals have helped to deliver support for the parliamentary coup, and in Africa, where with the support of US evangelicals, the Catholic and other Christian churches are being drawn away from a commitment to economic justice and aligning themselves with authoritarian power in order to resist homosexuality and women's rights. And so, as I look around the world, it seems to me that the crises created in part by the failed policies of neoliberalism, the economic crisis, the falling stature and status of everyday people around the globe, have created openings that in more cases than not, right-wing forces have seized upon to take state power. And that's not always been in the same way or the same constellation of forces. Sometimes in the case of the United States, through a nominally electoral process, even if it didn't meet true standards of democracy, and in places like Brazil with a much more aggressive seizure of power, for instance, through a parliamentary coup. But around the world, we see this kind of realignment. We'll get a chance to circle around to talk about some of the solutions to these crises, but I want to pull in Saskia Sassen now and Kumi Naidoo to elaborate a little bit on how you see some of the key underlying trends related to the global crises that we're facing. Saskia.
That's me.
That's you. Thank you so much for being with us. with your book, Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy, you address a transition in global capitalism away from the Keynesian idea of inclusion of as many people as possible, even if for the purpose of economic exploitation, towards a logic of extreme expulsion, of exclusion, of ever-expanding swaths of humanity and also nature, and what you refer to as a savage sorting. Please tell us what you mean by that, and what global trends you're seeing in the neoliberal economy.
I was actually enjoying hearing you. I mean, you packed a lot of stuff, you know, in 10 minutes, but I'm going to try. So maybe as a setting, you know, to clarify, I think that the capitalism that we had after World War II, that's one, it started actually earlier, you know, but World War II is one way of putting it, until the 1980s, it's a kind of ironic capitalism, because mass consumption was the dominant logic. So even the nastiest firms wanted the middle classes and the working classes to do well. Why? Because they would buy more. I mean, you understand that it's a kind of ironic capitalism. That breaks. That breaks in the 1980s when we go for the global economic project. Global economic project, very different from other kinds of global projects that are really very worthy, very good. So at that point, with privatization, deregulation, and the entering in a whole new mode, very different from the old transnational firms. Remember, the United States has been playing around the world, as has the Netherlands, as has France, et cetera, for a very, very long time. But it's a new phase. And one very brief way to put it is that the dominance of logics of consumption is replaced by logics of extraction. Think Google, just to give a familiar example. Once they had the platform is admirable, it's great, what would we do without it? But they actually were extractive. They got information about all of us for zero cost, and then sold it at a very high cost to firms. That is a very easy way to make money. Facebook is even more extreme. It doesn't, you know, whatever, but we all need Facebook because it's a way of connecting, I know that. I've finally decided, because of what's happening now with the politics in the country, to join Facebook. I resisted being on Facebook, but I'm still having a hard time to adapt. But anyhow, that is truly a secondary matter. So Google sells all this stuff, logics of extraction. Finance. Finance, to me, marks this current period even more strongly, though less visibly, less recognizably, than the Googles and the Facebooks and all of that, which still have some good utility functions. And here I think it is very important, just to put it on the table, that the traditional bank is okay. It's commerce. It sells you something, money for a price. You know, we all need it. You want to have a bike to be greener? Okay, the bank can help. Finance, and so the traditional bank sells something it has, money. Finance sells something it does not have. And in selling what it does not have lies its brilliance. It has nothing to do with microeconomics. It's all algorithmic math, basically. When you entered Goldman Sachs, for instance, where the back room where the secretaries used to sit, 100+ physicists. Now, I'm not blaming the physicists for finance. They just do these brilliant whatevers. But so that means that finance is basically extractive. Now, we think of these very advanced sectors that dress themselves in beautiful clothing of intelligence, of major sort of intellectual advances, as they've got to be good. Well, not always. We academics were very good people, okay? I want to emphasize, I'm not against knowledge, in other words. But so finance actually is financializing a lot. Take the student debt in the United States, $1 trillion. So the traditional bank doesn't know what to do with that. What do I do with $1 trillion that is debt? Finance, $1 trillion. Come on, I know what to do with it, and they are. Finance has financialized a lot of things. A lot of the buildings, like Lower Manhattan, all these, they exist on two levels. The building, what we buy the building or whatever, and then a financial world where it might be the door of the building or whatever, but it keeps selling, et cetera, and accumulating. Just final point, just to mark what you already said, but to mark it in other terms. So global GDP, you know what that is, right? A problematic measure, but it measures it's one measure of the economy. It's increasingly not adequate, but it's about 200 trillion of all the countries in the world. Global finance, different from traditional banking, a quadrillion. That's 3 more zeros on the side that counts. Do you understand what that means? And if you take the currencies as issued by all the central banks in the world, that's about 400 trillion. So finance is not about money. It's something else. And that is, to me, sort of very emblematic of this current period. I also think that finance has sort of overdone it. And it's in trouble right now. I don't know if people have picked up a few of the commentaries. So that's a very positive moment. Though I would say, you know, if we could, I always have this image, that's the practical Dutch in me. You know, all that capital up there, if we could just bring it down and use it to build social housing, to clean up all the toxic dumps we have, you know, we could do that. But that means a very different type of instrument, but we also need the physicists for that one. But you know, so there are battles to be had, even in this which seems so far away. No, we could do that. We could force it if we would have a different president. Is that a president that we have?
Some say.
Anyhow, I was not so happy with either one of the two, I confess. I put all my cards on the table here. But a kind of mind like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, I put all my cards now on the table, that would have seen, okay, how do we make this work for a larger good? All right, I shut up.
Saskia, could you give a practical... You asked us, do we understand? Well, help us to understand.
Yeah.
In this shift from a consumer-based model of economic development to this securitization and financialization, how does that relate to the broader theme of your work, which includes this notion of growing exclusion and expulsion of vast numbers of people and even nature from economic systems?
Yeah. I mean, let's take a familiar example. The subprime mortgage, we all heard of that, right? You know that these are the data now from our central bank, from the Fed. So 14.5 million households in a period of 5 to 7 years lost their homes. Some are still living in those homes, but they don't own those homes anymore. Now, what happened there? And now we have a lot of empty homes, right? What happened there? Finance went into that, nothing to do with mortgages. Mortgage was a little instrument. So it was like you create a big field where you put in all these materialities. The total was 16 million homes that they used. 16 million homes. But it's like a field. It has nothing to do with the individual houses. It's as much materiality as you can bring in there to produce an asset-backed security, because the high investor circle had picked up on the fact that, what are we doing here? Give us an asset-backed security, no more derivatives based on other derivatives. So they said, well, what materialities do we have left here? Yeah, poor people who don't own a house, we can use them. You know what they did? It was like an army deployment. Every intermediary that had to get a signature sign, you don't have to pay anything. At the beginning, you had to pay a bit. Just sign. They needed, every intermediary had to get about 500 signatures per week. They collected over 16 million. These are the potential buyers, the supposed buyers. And they used people, they used the language of mortgages in order to create a material base from which they could elaborate fancy instruments. This is truly insidious. Goldman Sachs bought as much aluminum as it could. This was in the news. I don't know if people heard this. They had to go to trial. They avoided the... And whenever there was... So that created a scarcity of aluminum in the financialized sector. Are people still with me, I hope, here? Anyhow, you know how we found out? The truckers. The truckers, they were trucking this aluminum from one warehouse to another. And the truckers began to say, why are we moving it? You know what that was? By moving it, Goldman Sachs managed to delay delivery of aluminum and thereby created a scare in the global market. Oh my God, we're running out of aluminum. Now, do you understand? This is not a way in which we should use our intelligences and our capabilities. This is absolutely ridiculous. You can't just do this. Anyhow.
So there are better uses for physicists than figuring out how to circulate aluminum-bearing trucks in order to create scarcity. Kumi, I want to pull you into this conversation. Saskia was talking in some ways about the shift away from a mass consumer-based economic model, even while maintaining a highly extractive one. Yet your work, which includes at its center work to avert potential climate catastrophe, addresses the question of the ongoing model of consumerism that continues to drive the economy. Tell us a little bit about what you see as the principal forces driving us towards climate catastrophe and how it relates to this question of consumerism in contemporary economics.
Thank you, Tarso. Good morning, everyone. I should confess that I have a little bit of a sense of déjà vu, which is when you, during the South African liberation struggle, if you follow two absolutely eloquent, thoughtful presentations like what we've heard, then you started by saying most of the really good points I want to make have been eloquently made by the previous speakers. And then you said, however, for emphasis, and then you spoke for 2 hours. So
I think we have another 15
seconds. So I think that we are in deep denial about how broken our politics is, how broken our economic system is, and how devastatingly close we are to massive ecological collapse.
Yeah.
The reasons for that is, firstly, I would say that we are suffering from a new global disease, which is probably the most devastating disease. It's been around for several decades now, and it's a disease, not HIV/AIDS, not influenza, but it's what I would call affluenza. Yeah. Which is basically people have been led to a pathological illness where we believe, or led to believe, that happiness actually comes from more consumption, bigger consumption, more wasteful and almost frivolous consumption. So what we find now in the private sector, for example, the more enlightened elements would say, to address the climate crisis, we need to do more with less. Right? By that they mean, how do we make more efficiencies in the production system and so on. But the problem is, that's insufficient now. We cannot actually simply, that's a good thing, by the way, trying to do more with less, but that's insufficient because in the DNA of the economic system that we have, it's all about more markets, more profit, more products, and so on. So unless we actually begin to go back to connecting spirituality with our economic system, getting people to understand what exactly constitutes happiness, what constitutes a good and decent, meaningful life, we don't have a chance. We have to understand that the challenge before us is actually massive kind of values interrogation is what we need right now. The United States, to be honest, is for a very long time has been suffering from two big problems: economic apartheid and a deepening democratic deficit. And I was jokingly saying even like 15 years ago that there are only 3 types of people in the United States that can run successfully for political office: the rich, the very rich, and the extremely rich, or the obscenely rich. And it is the interests of that top 1% of society that is actually making it impossible for us to have the kind of courage that we need to address the climate crisis. And let's be just very clear. The climate crisis cannot now be addressed by incremental tinkering, baby steps in the right direction. For example, I often used to say, recycling is a very good place to start as an individual or as a community. It's a horrible place to end, right? Because it's totally insufficient. So within that context, I think we need to look at the connection between the nature of the economic system and the nature of ecological collapse potentially. And Saskia correctly made reference to GDP, right? And said it's a very powerful, in fact, you could say GDP is the world's most powerful number, right? As Lorenzo Ferramonti says, former colleague of mine. And there's this book, I recommend you look at it, called GDP, Gross Domestic Problem, right? Because the very nature of GDP at the moment, in terms of what you will put on the positive side of GDP measurement, if you go and destroy a forest, which we need.
It's positive.
It's positive.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. If you actually fire a lot of workers and your growth goes up,
right,
that can also be positive.
Highly problematic.
So on the positive side, though, I would say that right now, young people throughout the world, I am seeing, are refusing to accept that young people are the leaders of tomorrow, that old farts like me say, right? Because young people must realize right now that if they wait for tomorrow before they take leadership, there might not be a tomorrow to exercise leadership, right? So the final thing, and this I say to both of you as much as to the audience because I'd love to get your reaction. I would argue that the thing that we have to fix within our movements, within progressive academia and so on, and the thing we have to acknowledge, that the two biggest problems in the world today is a broken financial system and economic system and the climate crisis. And both of them have something very much in common. The thing they have most in common is that not only the power brokers in those two worlds speak in ways that 99.99% of the people cannot understand, but also the so-called progressive activists also talk in a language that actually excludes 99% of the people from the conversation. So part of the solution is those of us who claim to be progressives, who claim to be on the right side of history, we have to humble ourselves, not project our language and our consciousness on the people that we're trying to organize, but actually humble ourselves to start with the consciousness of where people are. Because if we don't do that, we are just as bad as those that we accuse of authoritarianism and totalitarianism.
So Kumi, I'm glad you brought this point up because among one of the things that the three of us who have just met actually today in person for the first time have in common is a communications challenge, right? We each address some horrifying trend lines, right? How to do that in a way that invites engagement in effective action rather than fear and paralysis, be it a conversation around rising nationalism or the expulsions of neoliberalism or catastrophic climate change. And so how do you think about, in your work, Saskia, maybe starting with you, how do you think about how your analysis about truly the brutality, that's in the title of your book, the brutality of this system, how does one present that as an invitation to effective engagement and struggle?
Yeah. Well, the brutality I speak of is a brutality dressed in the clothing of extraordinary complexity. Huh? So it is a double thing. No, but in sort of right now, what I am working on is how do we begin to relocalize what we now sort of do via franchising? That's one example. So my rhetorical question is, do we really need a multinational corporation to have a cup of coffee in the neighborhood? No, right? Because you see, I mean, now we're going to go very practical because, you know, I'm Dutch. We are ultimately practical. So the mom and pop shop of the neighborhood, say the flower shop, There was knowledge there. It was a knowledge space. They had to know what flowers to buy when, etc. Today, it's all a franchise. So not only is there a hollowing out in terms of knowledge, there is also the fact that when there is a franchise, part of the consumption capacity of a neighborhood or a locality leaves the locality. So that's one, and India is at major threat. I mean, I know that you're not in India, but, of that, because they're really fighting against bringing in the big. So this is a combat zone in much of the world. Secondly, I think that I am quite engaged with some digital tech aspects, but I've become particularly interested in understanding how can we develop rather simple digital tech, applications, if you want, that enable low-wage workers, both at the workplace and in the neighborhood. I think what we begin to need to work at is making a space that collectivizes every individual's life a bit in a modest setting now I'm talking about. And so how do we connect that? And can I give you one little very quick example? Please. So I have a whole list for any of you who are interested, all done by doctoral students, no commercial element here, of apps that are geared towards this kind of thing. So one of them is called the Emergency Nanny. By the way, we all need one, I'll tell you. So the Emergency Nanny is a little app that the worker who is at the workplace has a crisis. In a low-wage workplace, you cannot just pull out the phone and start to call. Say the aunt didn't come to take care of the mother who's very ill or the grandmother very ill in the house. What you can do, or he can do, is click on the app. The app mobilizes in the community, in the neighborhood, 5, 6 people, the hairdresser, people who are static, the person who sends little things, the butcher. You may not want the butcher to go take care of your kids, but anyhow, that's another matter. And they don't need to love each other, they don't need to trust each other, they then take over. So for me, this is the first little step. Number 1, helps that low-wage worker. Number 2, begins to make tissue in these neighborhoods. My experience in New York City is that a lot of the low-income neighborhoods, they are in deep trouble also in terms of, community aspects. They don't trust their neighbors. There are problems. They're so oppressed, so degraded in their jobs, etc. So this is just one little example of how you can begin to bring new kinds of economic activity, new kinds of possibilities for organizing, and also a kind of sense of self, of who you are. I could go on, but I am going to.
And Kumi, your work also is focused on questions of transition, away from this kind of an extractive political, social, and economic model. And you're using a just transitions framework. Could you talk a little bit about what that means to you and how you're moving forward?
Thank you. So one of the difficulties in the moment that we live in, and I confront this often, is, and let me give you an anecdote, often when I'm speaking at meetings and I'm talking about the fact that within 4 decades our oceans could be dead because of overfishing, dumping of toxics and ocean acidification, the fact that as we sit here in this hall, every 2 seconds a forest the size of a football field will disappear, even today. And you talk about the inequality crisis, and sometimes people at the end of the speech will...
Light morning banter.
Yeah. So people at the end of the speech will put up their... So I had this woman once here in the United States put up her hand and said, "Dr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" And I said, "Yes, he inspired me as a young activist." After one such speech of talking about the convergence of crises and so on. And she said, "Do you know what his most famous speech was called?" And thinking it was a trick question, I very tentatively said, "I have a dream." And then she had the mic in her hand still, and she shouted back at me. She said, "Yes, it was I have a dream, but when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare." Right? Everything is collapsing and so on. So one of the communications challenges more broadly, as well as about the just transition, and a leadership challenge, is how do we not lie to people? How do we speak truth to power? How do we tell people, folks, we are in a deep crisis and time is running out on the one hand, but how do we do it also in a way that does not demobilize, demotivate, depress, and devastate people to the point where people say, what's the point of activism? What's the point of getting involved?
Yeah,
and that's a very, very difficult challenge, right? But it's the challenge of our time, and it's a challenge that we have to rise to.
Yeah.
The other thing we need to do on the just transition, just to say what we mean by just transition, is none of us in the climate movement have said, we can switch off fossil fuels tomorrow. None of us in the climate movement today, actually, in the past maybe, but today are saying that our brothers and sisters that work in those dirty energy industry, I call them our brothers and sisters. The workers in those industry are our brothers and sisters, not the management necessarily or the ownership. And we have a responsibility to actually think about, if we are saying that we need to have a massive energy revolution that moves us from an economy that's driven by dirty brown fossil fuel-based energy to an economy that's driven by clean, green, renewable-based energy, how do we ensure that workers who work in those dirty industries are actually retooled, retrained, and they should not be punished.
Exactly.
They were not given a choice, right? So in terms of how we make that transition, again, it's not easy, but it's doable. And given that Donald Trump these days has just discovered that China is one of the best, wonderful countries in the world with a great leader, as he seems to be saying today, I heard him said, is a man of integrity. In China, there's a character, Wai Chi, which is the same character for crisis and opportunity. And myself and many other people have been arguing for more than a decade now. If we are smart, if we are bold, if we are prepared to actually negate some status quo notions that we've accepted over time, then we can turn the climate crisis into a real opportunity. For far too long, we've lived in a world of north, south, east, west, developing, this whole othering and belonging sort of frame. Climate crisis puts a new reality in the center of our conversations. It's saying to us, folks, whether you come from rich country, poor country, east, west, north, south, you either get this right as rich and poor countries acting together as a united global family, and we secure the future of all our children. If we don't, true, people in poor countries that carry the least responsible for emissions will die and get and be devastated first, as is happening in Africa right now. But ultimately, nobody, will be protected. So we need to now start saying that actually the climate crisis, in terms of how we do the transition, how smart we are in the way we do the transition, we have a moral obligation of turning it into a positive, energizing thing. Like we need to, for example, just to take one idea, simple idea. Let's not talk about 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, and all this parts per million and so on that confuses people. Let's talk about things like a rooftop revolution. Let's turn every roof of every home and every school and every religious place of worship, every factory and so on into 2 things. An electricity generator as well as an income generator. Because it happens in many countries around the world where families can generate and use electricity, the excess, they feed it into the grid and they get a return, income-wise, for that. Let's democratize and decentralize energy provision, recognizing that big power plants all over the world lose between 30 and 40% of energy generated in the transmission process. Why should we be doing things that are wasteful? And how do you make people to be more active citizens and more owners of the kinds of systems of energy that we build? Can I just say one thing quickly, right? So I want to be transparent about what I'm been thinking about a lot, right? So yesterday I made a reference to Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther King speaking in the 60s said, "My friends, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note that in the field of modern child psychology, there is a very dominant term called maladjusted. Now, we all want to live a well-adjusted life and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so immoral and unacceptable that all good, decent human beings should refuse to be well-adjusted until the good society is born."
Yes.
Right? And sorry, time constraints, don't clap, please. And then he went on to say, "I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to racial discrimination. And importantly, he said, I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty. Then he went on in the longer part of the speech to say, I now call for decent men and women around the world to come together to set up a new international organization called the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. So this challenge has not been taken up, but I'm happy to announce to you, anybody interested, get in touch. I'm working with a few people to set up the International Institute for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. I'm serious.
We may have about 1,000 founding members in the room.
Because I think that's what we need to do. We need to go back and challenge certain status quo assumptions. Why did we accept that it's okay to spend so much of money on military expenditure?
Absolutely.
For example.
So this question of finding the opportunity in our moment of crisis is one that we're talking a lot about, of course, right now in the United States in the context of the political situation here. And as dire as the election of Donald Trump is in terms of bringing to a head, I think what I would argue would be the most severe set of threats to human, civil, and constitutional rights in this country, probably since the period of redemption, the backlash against Reconstruction after the Civil War. It's also the case that there are tens of millions more people available to us collectively on the 9th of November than there had been on the 7th of November. And so there's a tremendous outpouring of organizing and activity and an incredible opportunity to think about pulling together new political formulations, new social formulations as a result of the consciousness of crisis among a growing number of people. And so I think that the kinds of epiphanies you're talking about, Kumi, in relation to ecological crisis, are also the case with respect to political and social crisis and economic crises. I want to pose a closing question to the two of you as we think about ways forward. The kind of market and consumptive logics that the two of you have been talking about have become so pervasive as to become common sense ideas. It's not, if neoliberalism at one point was in fact a right-wing project, I mean, it was developed by right-wing strategists, and there was a Mount Péralean Society, and von Hayek and Mises and the rest of it, it's now become the air we breathe, both in its metaphorical and in its toxic, right, results, and not just as a conservative idea. These are ideas, this kind of market logic is present in many of the nonprofits we might work in foundations in terms of how they think about efficiencies. Certainly many of the political parties that have described themselves as liberal or social democratic or even socialist in the context of Europe have adopted many of these same ideas, and so oftentimes progressives are put in the position of defending, right,
Absolutely.
a set of economic and social relationships that we don't believe in at all, that are entirely bankrupt, and it's the right that enters to say, yes, this is bankrupt, and we're put in a least of evils, a lesser of evils kind of conundrum. What in your work do you see as the greatest opportunities to break this kind of pervasiveness of market logic, of neoliberal logic, even in liberal and progressive spaces, be it the academy or
well, I'm having trouble getting and I usually don't have trouble having an answer, because the framing that you produced, it's not my comfort zone. I think there are multiple ruptures, there are multiple forms of incompleteness in all of that. I think that our political classes have failed us, capturing, other ways, like what happened in Europe with the refugees. The easiest thing for the political classes was not to deal and to allow those who racialized the whole question of the refugees. So, we have a lot of that too here. But let me put it in another way. So let's think the frontier zone. So in the old empire, the frontier zone was the edge of empire, right? And the frontier for me is a space where actors from different worlds have an encounter for which there are no established rules of engagement. So that holds also for our situation, right? In a way that we're dealing, like what you were alluding to, really different ways in which we can think about it. So in the past, that frontier zone was the edges of empire, right? And basically, we, the West, went there, didn't dialogue very much, and just slaughtered them. Today, in my reading, and I don't know if this makes sense to others, the only frontier space we have left is deep inside our big, messy, not fully controllable cities. While when we look through a satellite to the world, it looks like there's a lot of green, it's all owned. Every year, 1 to 3 million people are thrown off their, smallholders are thrown off their land because what you were describing about the wood and the whatever, right? So there is no more empty space. You know, there are a few tribes that are left, like in the Amazon. So our big cities become a crucial, by big city, I mean a city that cannot be fully controlled. It doesn't have to be big. I don't know about Oakland. It strikes me that Oakland is the kind of city that I'm talking about, given the history of contestations. But so the difference between the two actors who have an encounter in that frontier space in a big city is that those without power can say, power, this is also our city. And in Argentina and Latin America, we have this great phrase. I grew up in Latin America. Estamos presentes. We're present. Not we're asking for anything, no. We're just letting you know that this is also our city. So for me, the urban condition actually begins to play yet another role. Besides the finance and all of that, there is this other space. And when I think about suburbs and I think about small, very nicely well-run towns, I don't see that possibility. Now, I may be completely wrong in what I'm saying, but it seems to me that this is very important because it means that those without power can gain a kind of complexity in their powerlessness. It's not that they become powerful, but in part they don't need to be super powerful in that kind of space in order to be actors that start new projects, et cetera, et cetera. That is
there's this appealing notion globally, and certainly in the United States, a lot of discussion about this idea of rebel cities as places for both organizing resistance, for instance, to reaction from above in the case of the federal government here or many other places, but also as areas, somewhat liberated areas for experimentation about other models of social engagement, of economic development, and so forth. And yet, when I look at
I find those terms, I find rebel city, sanctuary city, it's a bit too precious, it's a bit too confining. It's not real life. Real life, I mean, every one of those people has work to do, they have children to take care of. So it's like almost an elite project.
Well, you've anticipated part of my question, which is, you know, what are the limits of the possibilities there? Especially when I look at national votes, whether in the United States, where Trump picked up 30 million votes in rural and
I want to come back to what John Powell said.
Or in France, where we saw the electoral results of the election, which split largely along metropolitan and exurban lines. How does one avoid a situation where rebel cities are archipelagos, right, surrounded by a sea of reaction that we have just conceded?
But the real city isn't that way. What John Powell said this morning, how do we begin to make this kind of tissue? I don't know, he used better words. I think the city is a big, messy condition, cannot be fully controlled. So, and it's part of daily life living. It's not just, okay, now we're going to the barricades. You know, and that is why estamos presentes means we're here, this is our city. I want to think about it in that way. So I like, in today's moment, et cetera, the image of sanctuary city, rebel city, great. You know, it can mobilize like some of the students at Columbia University. They love that. But real life is what John was talking about this morning. You know, and that is people and making tissue, et cetera, et cetera. So that is what I would say. So the images are good, and for certain media outlets, it's a revolution to use those terms, right? The New York Times, you know, rebel cities, wow. That's good. I think that's good. But that's not the real life, yes.
So another way of thinking about this, Kumi, is the reality is this political geography that we have for what it means to realize the kind of just transition that you were talking about?
Well, I'm glad you used political geography because, there was a slogan in the 1980s that said, think globally, act locally. Any of the older people remember that?
Yeah. I'm older people, I remember.
But there was a feminist in India, Devaki Jain, who said, actually, hang on a minute. If we think globally and we act locally, and if real power around trade, around climate policy, around finance, around monetary policy is shifting from the national to the global level, and if we think globally and we act solely locally, then in fact we are removing ourselves from when real power exists. And she said maybe we need to be thinking locally in terms of what our needs, and if real power sits at the global level at the World Bank, IMF, WTO, and so on, we need to think globally and act globally. Sadly, dear brothers and sisters, we don't have the luxury of choosing one or the other.
Yeah.
We have to think and act globally, and we have to think and act locally, and understand the interconnections between different levels of geographical levels of struggle, from local, statewide, national, or federal, as you call it here, regional, as in our case, Africa. Now, I just want to say something quickly about Africa, if I might. Given that all of you, whether you know it or not, your ancestors come from Africa. You can go check that out. So moving forward, I think, how are we trying to advance creative maladjustment in our context? So for one, we are saying in Africa right now, as social movements, we are launching on 25th of May a new movement called AfricansRising for Justice, Peace and Dignity. And we are including in that movement all our brothers and sisters in the African diaspora. So anybody here who would like to get involved, come and see me. I have some leaflets that I can give to you. And part of the way we do it is challenging narrative and being bold. Like, so for example, for about 15 years now, ever since the euro, the common currency in Europe was adopted, I've been jokingly saying, if Europe can have a euro, why can't Africa have an afro? And I'm not talking about the hairstyle. So just the idea of imagining not better hairstyles, because, when I was on the run from the cops, I had a afro when I was in my early 20s. But it's about how you can actually reimagine in quite a fundamental way how we reorganize society. We have to almost acknowledge we have to press the reset button on many things. And we have to do it with the right balance of courage and humility and compassion. So on courage, what I would say, an example of courage, if you see an organic, powerful grassroots movement like Black Lives Matters emerge, you're going to be attacked, right? So like, for example, one of the attacks on that is, what about white lives? Shouldn't all lives matter? Now, when I was at Greenpeace, for example, I used to say, often, save the whales. Because I said save the whales, I didn't say go kill all the other animals. I was just recognizing that actually whales needed a particular kind of support and intervention, just as it's completely legitimate, given the decades of discrimination, that black people have a right to say our lives matter. But on the other hand, let me just say, I have a real discomfort about how we talk about the right wing, how we talk about Trump supporters, and so on. I want to appeal to you. If we are going to win, we have to see the humanity in the people that voted for Trump. Painful as that might be for some of us, I think it's a moral imperative that we have to be able to find a bridge of communication and dialogue with the people that feel the sense of fear, alienation, and so on that drove them to support Trump. So compassion and courage has to be part of what we need to make the transitions to secure our children's future, and the compassion and courage needs to be in equal measure. Thank you.
Thank you, and please join me in thanking Saskia Sassen
Tarso,
and Kumi Naidoo.